Now taking a look at our style sheet, you can see we've addressed styles for color, for the grid, column layout, and for spacing. Let's see if we can do something about the text. It's looking pretty ugly with the defaults here. So far we've just been setting up different classes. What we're going to do now is we're going to change some of the text defaults right on the body element. You could also do it on the HTML element, but it seems a little more common to do it on the body element. And either way, it'll impact your entire site. The first thing we can set is the font size. As mentioned, all major browsers default to 16 pixels. I recommend leaving it at 16 pixels. It's what people are used to. But if you want to change it, don't change it in absolute terms. Don't change it to like 18px or 14px. Change it using RMs. Like 1.1 RM would increase the font size by 10%, something like that. The next thing we could adjust is the font weight. That's how bold or light it is. The default is 400 if you use a numeric value or normal. We'll leave that unchanged. Background color, default is white. You could change it to off-white if you wanted to, but we'll leave it at white. Color is the text color. As usual, we're going to be mimicking what Bootstrap does, and they actually use a dark charcoal color instead of black, so it's not quite so dark. You could leave it at black if you like, but we'll change it. And the next thing we can change is line height. That is the space between each line in a paragraph. The default is 1.2, so 1.0 would be no space between the lines. 1 would be the font size. We're going to change it to 1.5 for accessibility. People who are somewhat visually impaired have more difficulty reading lines that are too close together. So we'll change that to 1.5. Let me save it with Command S. And you can see it's much easier to read like that. And let's create some utility classes. Bootstrap also has these utility classes to where we can adjust the line height using these classes if we wanted to. Squeeze it together with a 1 or double space with this class. Now let's take a look at the font. The major browsers have a default font of Times or Times New Roman, which is a print font, common in newspapers or magazines, something like that. And it has a serif, which is these little tails on the ends of the letter. It's great for print, but for computer screens, especially if it has lower resolution, these little tails can be a little blurry. So you're generally going to want to use sans serif fonts, which don't have those little tails. So let's take a look at the Bootstrap font. The property is called Font Family. And the way it works is the browser will look for the first font listed. If it's available, it'll use that. If not, it'll go to the second. And if not, the third, all the way on down until it finds one. Now you're going to want to have a generic font of last resort. Sans serif is the generic font for a sans serif. All browsers are going to have that font. So let's take a look at this font stack. System UI will use the device's operating system's base font, which will give your website kind of a native app feel to it because it'll look like the other apps on the operating system. However, this property value is fairly new and it hasn't been available in all browsers until 2021. So we're going to have a fallback of each device's font. So Apple system will use the system font for Mac and iOS. Segoe UI is the Windows 10 font. Roboto is the Android font. Helvetica is a font common in Mac. Arial is a font common in Windows. I don't know what these are. And then we've got the base font here, generic. And then beyond that, we've got some emoji fonts. So it's a pretty good stack. Let's save it and see what this looks like. Okay, it looks much better. You can see the serifs are gone, the little tails are gone. Now let's address the heading elements. This is an H1 top level heading. This is an H3 heading, as is this and this. This is an H4 heading. It's not looking too good. So let's address that. Again, let's mimic what Bootstrap does. I've got it in my clipboard. I'll just paste it here. So the first thing we want to do is set some styles to be the same across all headings, H1 through H6. We just list all the tags separated by commas. Now by default, the browser will put a margin on both the top and bottom of a heading tag. We want to eliminate the top margin and just have a bottom margin, and we'll make it consistent at 0.5 rm or 8 pixels. The font weight by default is going to be bold. Numerically would be 700, and normal font is 400. We want to put it bolder than normal, but not quite so bold as bold, so we'll set it at 500. And the last thing is line height. We changed the default line height to 1.5. That's going to be a little bit big for a heading if it spans 2 lines, so we'll change that down to 1.2. The next thing to notice are the font sizes. These will set for each individual tag. H6 is going to be the smallest, H1 the biggest. By default, the browsers use M's to set the font size. That has a potential problem of cascading the sizes. So we're going to use RMs instead of M's. And the other thing browsers do by default is H4 font size is the same as the normal font size, and H5 and 6 headings are actually smaller than normal font, which is a little weird. So we're going to change it so H6 is the same as the normal font size, and as you go up, it's going to get progressively bigger for each heading tag. And also we're going to use a combination of RM plus a % of the viewport width, the screen's width. So at the top level, we're going to use 1.375 RMs plus 1.5% of the viewport's width. I assume Bootstrap did a lot of work in coming up with these dimensions, so we'll just go ahead and go with that. The last thing to note is we've set up some utility classes to where we can set the font size of an element using class fs-1 to be the same size as an H1 element without giving it the semantic meaning of an H1 heading tag. So these classes are available if you want to use them. Let's go ahead and save it and see what it looks like. Command S. Okay, it's looking a little better. You know what, let's go ahead and make our self-coded version of this site responsive. The Bootstrap version is already responsive, but we want this text to take up the whole width of the screen and this about section to stack below these highlighted articles when the screen is smaller, like it is here. It's actually pretty easy to do. Let's take this class and move it into one of these media queries. 992 pixels. It's about the size of a smaller laptop. And let's take the entire grid section, place it in here. Now watch this. We'll save it. And there we go. You can see the about section down here. And then if we increase the width, there you go. Now it takes up about 2/3 and the about section appears in a separate column. Now let's look at how we can make text bold or italic or how to center it. At the bottom of our text CSS, let's paste some utility classes here. Text center will center the text. Text start will align it to the left, which is the default. Text end will align it to the right. FW bold will make the font weight bold. FST italic will change the font style to italic. Text decoration underline will set text decoration to underline. And text decoration none will set the text decoration to none. For instance, if you have a link that has an underline by default and you want to remove it, you would use this class. Now let's see these in action on our index page. I'll just insert some random stuff temporarily and save it. Okay, so I've created an H5 heading tag with the class text center, and you can see it's centered here. And then I created a paragraph that has the class FW bold. When you make an element bold in the CSS, it doesn't imply any special meaning. It's merely stylistic. However, if you want to imply special meaning, then you should use the B or the strong tags. The B tag is an inline element that is displayed as bold. It's used to draw the reader's attention, but doesn't necessarily imply any special importance. The strong tag also makes it bold, but it does indicate strong importance or seriousness or some kind of urgency, something like that. Now, what's the difference? They look the same. Well, if the user's using a screen reader, the screen reader will interpret a strong element a little differently than it might interpret a bold element, and somehow indicate that it has stronger importance. Now, if you want to make text italic for aesthetic reasons, let's do that to the title up here. You just add FST-italic, save it, and you can see strictly for styling purposes, it's now italic. But if you want the italic to have some kind of special meaning, then you should use either the I or the EM tags. They both are displayed as italic, but the I tag is used to distinguish the content from the surrounding element without necessarily emphasizing it. It just says it's different for some reason. The EM tag indicates emphasis. Again, the display is identical, but if you use the screen reader, presumably if it's in an EM tag, it's going to give emphasis to the word. Save it. Okay, let's switch over to Bootstrap and see if everything looks the same. Let's comment out our own local style sheet and uncomment the Bootstrap CDN. Okay, let's see if anything changes. Command S to save. Identical. That wraps up this section.